which is statements from Council and Commission on the outcome of the Copenhagen Summit on Climate Change.
Aspettiamo che sta arrivando la signora Ministra.
The Minister is just on her way.
E diamo il benvenuto alla signora.
We'll say good afternoon to Mrs. Espinosa Mangana.
Signora, è pronta per...
Madam Minister, are you ready to take the floor? Can I give you the floor right away, Madam Minister?
Sì? Bene, grazie.
Jolly good. Okay, President in Office, you have the floor for 10 minutes on behalf of the Council.
Señor Presidente.
President, honourable members, I'm appearing before you today in order to have an exchange of views and my own opinions concerning the results of the Copenhagen conference and the challenges that still remain for us stemming from that conference, both for the European Union and also for the rotating presidency which Spain is responsible for during the first half of 2010. The European Union Environment Ministers have already discussed and given thought to these various issues over the course of the last weekend. And I would like to highlight the fact that there's a broad agreement and will to continue making progress on 3 issues. We have to continue to build up on the results of the conference to ensure that they are operational as soon as possible. We have to strengthen the elements, various elements within the United Nations, and we have to work to be able to meet our overall targets for an overall reduction of emissions. So we therefore share objectives and we share the same strategy. And the work we have to do will be an immediate result of this. And we have to conclude the whole process of formal communication of our commitment. We have to consolidate an action framework which was comparable to that of other industrialized and emerging countries, and we have to make sure that we can use the tools available to us both within the European Union and those that we have in our relations with third countries. The December summit was a highly complex summit and characterized by quite arduous discussions on procedure. But ultimately we ended up with a Copenhagen agreement. And of course there was considerable involvement and personal backing from a large number of heads of state and government and leaders of regional groups who represent the will of their own countries to try, and obviously these are countries that they're responsible for over 80% of the emissions at the world level. And there were very many participants from industrialized countries, emerging economies, and also from some particularly vulnerable countries. And I think we are going to have to try and reply to the very many doubts that have arisen and that are holding up the whole formal process that we have to conclude, and with a view obviously to coming up with binding legal solutions within the UN, hopefully, preferably in Mexico. And I think it is important to highlight that there is strong support and backing for the fact that the overall increase in temperature not exceed 2 degrees centigrade. And I think this is one of the strongest elements that we really have to push. And there's a commitment obviously on the part of all industrialized countries to set a reduction target which is applicable to the whole of their economies. And the emerging countries obviously are going to have to adopt specific measures which can be verified in order to bring about a substantial reduction in their emissions growth. And obviously we need a kind of financing and funding based on solidarity which will support immediate actions, and then in the medium term will help us in our fight against climate change. And there are various elements, of course, which are going to have to help us in our own efforts at governance so that we can support technological development and bring down emissions which are caused by deforestation. The Copenhagen conference, I think, was an example of the fact that we are now moving on within a different international context, and obviously we have to make the necessary improvements if we want to find replies to these global general problems. And the rules that we have to adopt and the decisions we need to take have to be able to adapt effectively and efficiently to the new times and our new needs and requirements. And we do have the necessary tools in order to act. We have at the community level, there's the commitment, obviously, at the highest level to continue with our work to reduce emissions, work on the basis of international solidarity, promote innovation, and have technological cooperation. And this institutional structure, we have that also. And we have to combine our leadership within the Environment Council when it comes to the negotiating and designing the necessary policies we need to combat climate change. And we have to strengthen the various capacities that exist within the external area of external action. And at the same time, we are going to have to involve these various elements and mechanisms in our own economic policies and policies concerning innovation, and strengthen the consistency of our objectives when it comes to climate issues, but obviously make sure that they are compatible with our own model of development and well-being. And obviously we do have the people who are able to do this, but there is the public opinion that has an important role to play as well, and we have to work to protect our collective interest. We have our own European experience that we can bring to bear as well. And I think, first of all, we have to try and come up with a suitable reply before the 31st of January. The Copenhagen Agreement has brought together all those who wish to reduce emissions, and obviously we have to look at the various efforts all of us are making. There has been a demand by the European Union to take a look at, to see whether we can compare these efforts. And if we don't have sufficient commitment, then we have to work to ensure that there's a collective effort. We also have to ensure that the various elements that are in the agreement be applied as quickly as possible. It's absolutely essential that the European Union and its member states be at the forefront of that group of countries that honour their word. And I think this is why we have to ensure that those monies that have been committed be transferred for the period of 2010-20 to 2012. And we have to develop some kind of financial architecture which is going to be able to back up our own commitments, solidarity commitments with third countries, and this in the form of the Copenhagen Green Fund for Climate Action. And we have to try and promote and foster progress in other areas as well, in accounting rules, and also when it comes to reducing emissions caused by deforestation, and also look at technological cooperation. And we have to take a look at our own policies which we are implementing in order to bring about our own targets of emissions reductions both at national and community level. We have to give a boost to innovation and intelligent energy use, integrate various adaptation and adjustment methods in all sorts of other policies. And obviously we wish to work very closely together with the Commission and the Parliament. And when it comes to building the European Union up as one of the most advanced regions of the world when it comes to the fight against climate change and bring down the carbon emissions. And we want also to be a region which is able to meet the challenges that are posed by climate change, and we want to be the main motor for innovation and competitiveness. The whole policy of fighting climate change is one of the main characteristics and features that characterizes the identity of the European model. We, I think, have been pioneers when it comes to integrating this principle into our own proposals for a fair and sustainable development, not only at the economic level but also in the area of social and environmental issues, because we know, of course, that we're strengthening and further reinforcing international security. We know, of course, that there are other main actors, China, the United States of America, who are sitting at the same negotiating table and have identified and share the same central elements of cooperation. The European Union has been a staunch defender of the role of the United Nations when it comes to solving all sorts of global issues, and obviously the European Union is going to have to work in other contexts as well, either on a bilateral or multilateral basis, on a formal or informal basis. We have to help to improve the opportunities, listen to our partners, collaborate when it comes to consolidating sectoral replies, and have to be consistent when it comes to our own needs and requirements in the area of climate change. By adopting the Lisbon Treaty and with the entry into force of new institutions, this opportunity, we have to make the most of this opportunity by incorporating our own relations with third countries on a systematic basis in order that we can send out the most important messages in our fight against climate change. So this is quite a major challenge, a major task we have ahead of us, and the Spanish government is fully aware of the broad challenge that we're facing, but wishes to express its commitment to make as much progress as possible on all fronts to make sure that in Mexico we can arrive at an ambitious and binding agreement. And I don't think we should waste this political moment, the political moment that was created in Copenhagen. We're talking about our own credibility, and we have to stick to our guns and be firm in our own position. The new and increased powers that have been conferred upon the European Parliament, which bring us closer to our citizens, will allow us to have more intense and fruitful cooperation. And I'd like to conclude by welcoming this fact and reminding you that we're going to need you even more in our work, and we're going to need your support even more over the next 6 months, these very important 6 months that lie ahead of us. Thank you very much.
La ringrazio molto, signor Espinosa.
Thank you very much, Madam President in office. Let me give the floor now to Commissioner Rehn for 5 minutes, please.
President, honourable members, let me thank you on behalf of the Commission for the chance to discuss the outcome of the Copenhagen Conference on Climate Change and the follow-up to the Copenhagen Accord. My colleague Stavros Dimas asked me to say sorry on his behalf for not being able to be here himself because he is sick, which is particularly regrettable as this might have been probably his last plenary appearance, probably, and I volunteered to substitute Stavros in this very important debate. I want to express our appreciation for the active and supportive role the European Parliament played before the conference and at the conference itself. The contacts with your delegation throughout the conference proved most useful. In particular, you have played a crucial role in order to enhance our outreach with key players in other countries and other regions. I believe we share the view that the result of Copenhagen falls badly short of our goal of an ambitious and legally binding agreement which would be necessary to limit climate change to below 2 centigrade. This is extremely disappointing for all of us who have fought for years and years for concrete policy decisions to reverse climate change. The reasons for the failure were many, and I'll come back to them in a moment. Still, one may also conclude that the accord is better than no outcome at all, which would have been the worst-case scenario. On the one hand, to find something positive, the Copenhagen Accord at least recognises the need to limit climate change to below 2 centigrade, 2 Celsius. It also invites the developed countries to list economy-wide emission targets by the 31st of January this year, and calls for the developing countries to list mitigation actions by the same date. Furthermore, the accord sets the basis for a rather substantial financial package of $30 billion for the coming 3 years and recognises the need for $100 billion annually by 2020. On the other hand, the accord has serious weaknesses. It contains no reference to mid-term or long-term mitigation targets. The reduction pledges announced so far are not sufficient to stay within the target of 2 degrees, and there is unfortunately, in my view, little cause for optimism that we will see improved offers by the 31st of January, rather the opposite. Last but certainly not least, the accord is not legally binding, and perhaps even more worrying, it does not provide for the conclusion of a legally binding agreement this year, which was one of our key goals. Looking ahead, the next step will be to ensure that this accord at least will become operational and will pave the way for a new climate treaty which must urgently be agreed on in the course of this year. As a very first step, it will be crucial to ensure that all key parties now endorse the accord and notify their targets or actions by the 31st of January. Adequate financing also needs to be provided. In this respect, we need to explore ways of setting up a Copenhagen Green Climate Fund. And we must also strengthen alliances with countries and regions who share our vision of a successful outcome in the international climate negotiations. President, honourable members, to conclude, we have huge challenges before us to ensure unity at the European level, to engage strategically with key external partners, to maintain our full commitment to multilateral climate action. While there are many lessons to be learned from COP15, one striking lesson certainly is that we must learn to speak with one voice. In Copenhagen, China, India, the United States, other major powers each spoke with one voice, while Europe spoke with many and many different voices. The same goes for global economic governance and international security. And we are indeed at a crossroads today. Either we take determined and united action for Europe's ecological, economic and political revival, or we risk economic stagnation and political irrelevance. Let's take, dear friends, Copenhagen as an alarming warning of that scenario. We must do better than that, and we can do. Only by standing united can we succeed, and I look forward to working with you to achieve this objective.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. I give the floor to Mrs. Corien WORTMANN for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to begin by asking you to give our best wishes to Mr. Dimas and to thank him on behalf of the EPP for his commitment and engagement over the last few years, because we too are, of course, disappointed in the result of the Copenhagen summit. But it's important as well that we shouldn't forget that we did take historic steps forward on certain subjects when it comes to climate finance, deforestation and the 2%, even if the results are not complete. Of course, we would have liked something much more ambitious, see our European Parliament resolution. But of course, these are first steps that we now need to build on. It is extremely important that we conduct a thorough analysis of Europe's contribution to the summit, because at the crucial moment, Europe was missing. The summit was perhaps well prepared in substance and technically by Europe, but the actual performance on the day, as it were, was poor. You said Europe has to speak with one voice, but that is easily said and done with more difficulty. We have to avail ourselves of the new possibilities offered to us by the Lisbon Treaty now. There are now hopefully 2 new women in the front line, Mrs. Hedegaard and Mrs. Ashton. They have to put on a better showing when it comes to climate diplomacy for Mexico. Of course, the 30% objectives that we laid down in our November resolution must still stand. A 30% target, not just for Europe's ambitions, but for the world. We have to review our strategy, because our position is not shared by some key players. So we have to review our strategy, but we still have to cling to our ambition. Thank you.
Thank you very much, dear colleague. I give the floor to Marita ULVSKOG for 2 minutes.
Herr talman, fru minister, tack för er inledning.
Mr. President, Madam Minister, thank you very much for those introductory comments. The Copenhagen meeting was a failure. The gap between rich and poor, the distance between them has widened, and neither the Swedish presidency nor the Danish Prime Minister were able to head off that failure. Europe was absent, really. And after all the disappointment, I think we need to pick ourselves up and take the initiative again. Mrs. Hedegaard, the candidate Commissioner for the Environment, refused to admit that Copenhagen had been a failure, and that, in fact, increases the risk of the whole thing failing again. Commission and Council need to lay down the foundations so that we do have a binding agreement at the end of the whole process. I hope they stress the steps that the developing countries are going to need to make in order to deal with climate change. Are you going to do that? Are you going to have an emission limit moving for 20 to 30%? Are you going to stress the importance of Kyoto as a framework for any future agreement?
Dear colleague, I give the floor to Mrs. Corinne LEPAGE for 2 minutes.
Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, President, Minister, dear colleagues, and Commissioner. The reasons that led the very many heads of state and government to meet in Copenhagen are still there. And the failure of Copenhagen should not be seen as a reason for us to reduce our ambitions, quite the contrary. It is absolutely necessary for us to change our strategy, and we need a new strategy. This has to be a robust strategy, a dynamic and innovative strategy. It has to be robust because it is absolutely essential for us to not only maintain our targets but to increase them so that we can achieve a 30% reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. And we have to move our industry towards a green economy which is based on energy efficiency and clean processes. And we have to look at this new synthesis between information technology and environment technology, because the battle we started waging in Copenhagen is also that of industry and leadership. And we're talking about the industry of the 21st century. And we need a dynamic strategy, but obviously without legitimizing the whole UN process. We need to take initiatives vis-à-vis the United States and China in such a way that we can set up something which would serve as a foundation for an agreement in Mexico. And I don't think we should allow the G2 to function as we've seen it functioning in the past, and we're not going to be able to be successful unless we can speak with one voice. And I also said we have to be innovative when it comes to the carbon market, and I think we have to have a maximum price, a ceiling price, and we have to be innovative when it comes to the various methods for financing. For example, personally speaking, I think we should be opposed to a carbon tax on the border. And then we have to take a look at other parts of the world, including Africa. We have to look at public aid funds and perhaps see whether we would need to rename these and call them a carbon fund. So I think we really have a lot to do. We have to maintain the will that is on, that we all share, to be the leaders in when it comes to fighting climate change in the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. LePage. I give the floor to Mrs. Hassi for 2 minutes and 30.
Hyvät kollegat,
Dear colleagues, the outcome of Copenhagen is a disappointment for the reasons that have already been enumerated. For the first time in a UN document, there is a reference to the 2-degree limit, but the richest countries are responsible for for a 3-degree increase in the past. Now, the EU didn't show the leadership role required of it. This is the key to success in the future. We have to have an emission reduction target of at least 30%. Really, we ought to be aiming for 40% if we are to be consistent with the science. Report after report, most recently one carried out by the Dutch government, or commissioned by the Dutch government, that said that the 20% reduction is far from being the most ambitious possible in the world. The 30% emissions reduction now costs less than was initially estimated, than the price initially, the cost initially estimated for a 20% reduction 10 years ago. It is quite clear that there are some that want to sabotage an agreement, but if Europe were to really be in the avant-garde, it would be easier. Developing countries gave a lot of importance to Kyoto. We should commit ourselves economically to climate measures to be taken in developing countries without just renaming development cooperation funds. It is quite clear that the EU can only act efficiently if it speaks with one voice, but that wasn't the case. We have to now move ahead. It's not good enough for our specialists to come forward with a wealth of technical details. We now have to remove obstacles in our way and reform the UN methods of negotiations to make it more effective. We need to implement voting rules in particular.
Martin Callanan for 1 minute.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I hope that I'm proved to be wrong, but it looks to me increasingly unlikely that the talks begun and continued at Copenhagen will in fact lead to a legally binding treaty committing all of the major emitters in the world to large emission cuts. And in those circumstances, I believe it would be very foolish for those of us in the EU debating these matters to agree to even further emissions reductions. I mean, the figure of 30% has been mentioned. Mrs. Hassi just mentioned 40%. In the absence of a worldwide agreement, I think we would be crazy to agree to further reductions, because what we will do is run the risk of saddling our consumers with some of the highest energy bills in the developed world, making European heavy industry, large energy consumers, particularly uncompetitive in a worldwide environment. Already we've seen a lot of industry relocating to outside of the EU, simply of course transferring emissions from the EU to China, India, elsewhere. This is a crazy economic policy because of course it has no net benefit for the environment whatsoever. In fact, in some respects it has a net deleterious effect to the environment, as those goods are simply re-imported back into the EU after all. What we need is a comprehensive worldwide agreement. I'm fully in favour of that. I hope we will work towards achieving it, but in the absence of one, we should be very wary of further unilateral cuts in Europe. Thank you.
Grazie, onorevole Callanan.
Thank you, Mr. Callanan. Let me give the floor now to Mrs. de Brún for 1 minute, please.
Tá prainn le culnú atá ullmhianach agus ina cheangal glí. Is gádana leidathe astathe the daihead fan géad.
Reductions for 2020, 80 to 95% by 2050. These must be promised by the latest science. And such pledges cannot be made dependent on other people's actions. The whole world needs to know what are the true reductions in emissions that will be made. We need to know that the necessary funding will be made available for developing countries in order to deal with climate change and its consequences. We need clarity. We all need clarity. Who exactly is going to supply this funding? How much will each developed country give? How and when will it be made available? The lack of political will, which was made clear in Copenhagen, cannot happen again. And I also wish every good health for the Commissioner Demos.
Thank you, Mrs. de Brún. Let me give the floor to Mrs. Rosbach. 1.5 minutes, please. Thank you, Mr. President. As far as COP15 is concerned, we talked about climate refugees. People have always moved about, avoiding flood or drought, or famine, or natural disasters. But climate change and its impact on human beings and vice versa are difficult issues which we have to tackle properly. I wonder if we're really doing that. The way we use resources every day is important. We need to find new technologies, no problem with that. But don't forget, we already have methods available to sort out a certain number of these problems as far as Copenhagen is concerned. For example, look at the Cook Islands. Are we going to be able to protect them? Because it would entail colossal investment, and it's a particularly poor group of islands in the first place. We talk about wind energy, new types of refuse grading in Europe. The Cook Islands are disappearing bit by bit. Are we going to invest billions in the battle against climate change when the results are frankly doubtful or unimpressive? Look at the statistics. Research says that we have to start looking at climate change and battling against it now, but with specific action. Thank you, says the President. Mr. Griffin, for 1.5 minutes, please.
Mr. President, after Copenhagen, let us reassess the whole global warming story. At Copenhagen, we had the irony not just of Climate Gate 2, but also the onset of one of the harshest winters in decades. Since then, we've seen the debunking of the Potsdam sea level scare. The Goddard Institute has been caught fiddling the temperature records. The vanishing Himalayan glaciers have been exposed as a fantasy. Mr. Pachauri has emerged as a climate change profiteer. The world is cooling. Global warming is a fraud. This is not a victimless crime. Carbon taxes push up fuel prices, killing our old folk as we speak. The billions wasted researching this non-existent problem are billions that cannot be spent defeating real scourges, such as Alzheimer's, or ending real environmental disasters, such as deforestation. Carbon credit trading makes billions for city sharks at the expenses of families in poverty. The loss of agricultural land to biofuels has already doubled world food prices, so millions are starving while greedy corporations make even fatter profits. Those pushing the unscientific nonsense of man-made climate change, Shell, Monsanto, the international banks, Bilderberg One Worlders, carbon billionaires and their useful idiot allies on the left are running the biggest fraud in human history. They must and will be called to account, as should be their collaborators in places such as this. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Griffin. The next speaker is Peter Liese. 2 minutes, please.
Thank you, President, dear colleagues. Copenhagen, post-Copenhagen, then a lot is being talked about this, and I suggest that not only should we look at the rules in the UN, but we change the rules in our House, so that people like Mr. Griffin speak right at the end, not during the first round. And, ladies and gentlemen, obviously Copenhagen was a disappointment, because very many of the demands that we had and the expectations of our citizens were not at all fulfilled. And perhaps I could add one point to some of the points made by other speakers. We want an international agreement for emissions from air traffic and sea traffic, and no progress was made at Copenhagen in those areas. And as I said, it's a very disappointing result, because we know, of course, that everything that we lose every year means that we're going to have to make an even greater effort. And it means that we are going to have to put more effort into fighting this. And obviously it's a bit like a disease. The sooner you act to cure it, the easier it is. But I don't think we should see everything in such negative terms, because this morning I was actually asked whether climate change is now politically dead. But I don't think it is. We have to continue discussing this issue, and this is what our citizens are expecting of us. And we have to take a look at the more positive elements of Copenhagen. And if I can just focus on two examples, the commitments of two developing countries, Costa Rica and the Maldives, to become carbon neutral over a given period. And I think the rest of the world should draw inspiration from this. And then, I mean, these were smaller countries, but I think if you take a large country like Brazil, it's quite amazing to see what's going there. We ought to assess our mistakes, not be arrogant, and just continue to act as we have done up till now. And there's no point sort of beating our breast. We have to look forward. We've got to think of some kind of strategy together with the emerging countries, and all pool together to make this effort. Thank you.
Grazie, onorevole P.
Thank you, Mr. Leeser. Our next speaker is Joe Leinen. 2 minutes, please.
Ja, Frau Rat.
President in office, last week I attended the informal Council of Environment Ministers in Seville. That was one of the first council meetings to take place under the Spanish presidency. And because of a sad family matter, you weren't able to attend, but your Secretary of State, Teresa Ribera, stood in for you in excellent fashion. And the meeting was organized excellently, and we could really sense the commitment of the Spanish presidency to this issue. So far, so good. However, the result of that council meeting wasn't terribly satisfying. The Council of Ministers seems to be lacking direction and is divided. The member states are not of one mind as to how we should move forward, and that is not a good sign. And it will make your task more difficult, but it is of course your responsibility to achieve unity between the 27. There are three things I think that we should do in Europe after Copenhagen. First of all, we have to take back the leadership in climate protection. Secondly, we have to show credibility in with the assurances that we have given. Thirdly, we have to find new partners urgently on the way to Mexico. I agree with all of those who have said that we have to adhere to our commitment of 30%. We should continue to nail that objective to the mast. And on the 31st of December, the UN Secretariat in Bonn are going to talk about the 30%, not the old 20% figure. And if we make our efforts dependent on others doing the same, we'll get nowhere, and Mexico will get nowhere. Credibility means that the 7.2 billion euros have to be made available before Mexico. People in Africa have to notice that first measures are already on the way, and we have to win partners. Well, we need to develop climate diplomacy, and the African Union among others, but also with your help perhaps we can find partners in Latin America and Asia. We need to find enough partners in order to make an agreement possible in Mexico.
Leinen.
Thanks, Mr. Leinen. Our next speaker is Chris Davis. He has 2 minutes, please.
And fellow collaborators, we need to move on from Copenhagen. Truth is, we don't know the way. Stumbling around in the dark. I think we just simply have to explore every opportunity and hope that one or more of them will take us forward. But I'm sure we have to try and maintain our ambitions and keep our leadership. And on this point, there's a crucial decision coming up within the next fortnight, and I want to know what the Presidency is going to do to get it right. 40% of our emissions come from the fossil fuels burnt in our power stations. That's why the development of carbon capture and storage technology is recognised as so important. That's why the Council, 3 years ago, agreed that we should try and build up to 12 demonstration projects by 2015. Now, we agreed a year ago a method of financing those projects, to use 300 million allowances from the emissions trading scheme. Took 3 months for that idea to come from the Parliament to get approval by the Council. Unlocked a door. But 12 months later, we still haven't agreed how to choose the projects or use the money. The Commission has finally put forward a draft decision. It proposes only 8 CCS projects, and the timetable it recommends means that it will be impossible for them all to be built by 2015. Commissioner Rehn's got the hot seat then. I hope someone will pass him a note between now and the end of the debate so he can explain the lack of ambition in this document. But it must be agreed, however inadequate. We've got to move forward. It will be debated at a meeting of the Council's Climate Change Committee on the 2nd of February. And there's opposition from some Member States who oppose the Commission having a final say over the selection of projects and the use and distribution of the money. Now, this meeting will be the first opportunity since Copenhagen for the European Union to demonstrate whether it's going forward and taking practical steps or going to slip backwards. It's quite a crucial test, both for the Commission and the Presidency. So my question, President, to the Minister is the Presidency going to ensure that we get agreement at that meeting, or are you going to drop the ball?
Thank you, Mr. Davis. Our next speaker is Mr. Eickhout for 1.5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. President. Let's be very clear. Copenhagen was a failure. And there are 3 big losers from Copenhagen: the United Nations, the European Union and the climate. It is therefore vitally important that in 2010 these 3 losers are turned into winners on the way to Mexico. So that means 3 things have to happen. First of all, the EU must indeed speak with one voice. Mr. Rehn has already said this, but how is that going to happen? I want a specific answer. How are we going to speak on behalf of the EU in Mexico? Secondly, the United Nations. That means that Europe needs to assume leadership in the negotiations. It means we shouldn't just look at the United States and China to decide what to do. We should look at those countries that also want to do something about the climate. The African Union, Mexico, Brazil, South Africa. So you have to extend the number of countries that you can reach an agreement with. And thirdly, the climate. Yes, we agreed on 2 degrees centigrade, but 2 degrees centigrade means something. According to the science, it means that rich countries have to reduce their CO2 emissions by 40%. 30% is now being promised by the EU. On the 31st of January, Europe can show its leadership by coming forward with 30%. I'm calling on you to do that. Can you give me a clear answer on whether you will do so? That is a clear way to show leadership and to turn 2010 the year of the United Nations, the European Union and the climate.
Thank you. Mr. Eppink is our next speaker. 1.5 minutes, please.
President, I support the environmental goals for 2020, but I have some serious doubts about some methods. The Copenhagen conference was a good example of a bad method. And what were the lessons? The conference was too massive to be productive. A rock concert of 50,000 people is possible, a meeting not. And secondly, Europe was outfoxed by China and India, and the US joined in. Instead of being a decisive player, the EU was a confused spectator. Now what should we do? I think we have to reassess the form we used. Rather a G20 than an event of Woodstock proportions. Secondly, we have to stop displaying moral arrogance by telling China and India what to do. Important barriers to punish both countries would be disastrous. On the contrary, the EU should re-examine its stand-alone. That will ultimately undermine our own growth and employment. And finally, we need serious research on the body of evidence. ClimateGate was already a reminder. And the claim that the Himalayan glaciers are retreating now seems to be based on speculation. Some members of the IPCC now even predict global cooling. We need objective, impartial, scientific research and not agenda-driven political activism. What is true and what is not? Now we simply don't know, and I think we need to have the facts right first. And Mr. Commissioner, Mrs. Minister, I hope you will look at these questions with an open mind. Thank you.
Gracias, colega. Thanks very much. Our next speaker is Mrs. Sabine WILS for 1 minute, please.
Danke, Herr Präsident.
Thank you, President. The UN Climate Conference, I think, basically failed because of the interest on the part of industry and the living situation of very many millions of people in poorer countries and the islands that are threatened by flooding. We've let them down. And there doesn't seem to be any way that we can properly restrict this kind of global warming. And the European Union, within the interest of its own industry, well, they didn't seem to be able to make much progress either. And the target of reducing emissions by 30% by 2020 was not submitted in time. And so making everything depend on what other people are doing, I think, is taking a bet on the future. In China, we're talking about 4,600 tons of carbon emissions, and we know what the figures are for Germany and the United States if we compare these figures. But we need a proper strategy. The industrialized countries and the emerging countries are going to be meeting next year in Mexico, and they have to come up with a binding agreement with very concrete targets.
Thanks very much. Mr. Bloom, for 1.5 minutes, please.
Well, Mr. President, of course, you can tell I'm a sceptic because I don't dress like a scarecrow. I fought my way through the blizzard in Copenhagen, like many of you did. Interesting, isn't it, that we've had the coldest winter so far on record in London for 30 years. It's the same in Poland, it's the same in Korea, it's the same in China. We've had the coldest temperatures in Florida, Arizona, Texas, the first snow in Texas, I think, for 100 years. And of course, as Giles Corrin of the London Times said, my goodness me, we simply don't get it, of course. Of course, that's what global warming is all about. We've got to get used to freezing temperatures. Well, we've seen the Al Gore hockey stick, which is still, I gather, being shown in London state schools. Al Gore, snake oil salesman, crook. We've seen Professor Jones from the East Anglia University, crook. And now, you won't know about this yet because it's been kept out of the public domain, the New Zealand National Climate Database, and I have the figures here, all fraudulent. When are you all going to wake up? Scam, scam, scam.
Senor Bloom. Senor Bloom.
Mr. Bloom, Chris Davis has a question that he wants to ask of you. Would you mind answering such a question for Mr. Davis?
Senor Davis.
Mr. Davis, please make it as brief as possible, sir.
Well, apparently all the science of climate change is nonsense, according to Mr. Bloom, because we've had a cold winter. I wonder if Mr. Bloom would like to tell the House the difference between climate and weather.
Climate, Mr. Davis, is what we all have to put up with.
Está bien, tiene 1 minuto y medio ahora para...
Okay, now Mr. BALCZÓ for 1.5 minutes, please.
Elnök úr, köszönöm a szót. Tisztelt miniszterasszony, meglepő hírem van az ön...
Thank you, Mr. President. Madam Minister, I have some surprising news for you. The climate conference was a flop. There were no commitments entered into. There was nothing binding. And Kyoto is a good example of what happens when people enter into voluntary commitments. So we saw what Canada did. Canada signed the Kyoto Protocol and increased CO2 emissions by 26% without any consequences for it. The Copenhagen conference sent us a very clear message about the world in which we live. Our world is determined by economic fundamentalism. When human interests enter into conflict with the interests of the global business, it's global business that gets the upper hand. And behind global business is an economic elite. If we want to change the climate, we have to address, first of all, the political and moral climate in which we live. If we don't do this, people will be made to work for the economy rather than the economy working for people. Without that, without having guiding principles for a real ecological, social, market economy, then any climate conference is doomed to failure.
Gracias, colega. Por 2 minutos.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Mr. Saber for 2 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, President. If we're talking about Copenhagen and what happened there and the reality of it, I can very much remember some of the debates that we had prior to Copenhagen here. And obviously the Copenhagen summit was an international conference with its own rules, and you can only achieve results on the basis of goodwill. And when it comes to negotiations in Mexico, I think we ought to approach them more realistically. And if we are assessing Copenhagen, then I don't think it's quite so bad, because the result can at least serve as a basis for the negotiations in Mexico, and we did manage to achieve something. I think the main disappointment for us as Europeans is that we, as the European Union, were absent. We were not there when the final document was drafted, and I think that really ought to make us sit back and think, because we're always trying to say that we're the ones that want to be in the forefront, that we want to be the leaders, but when it comes in this whole fight against climate change, and why was this so? I think perhaps it's because maybe we're not the main CO2 emitters. We know that the US and China together account for about 50% of these emissions. But the truth is that we in Europe did not speak as a single voice, and this was very clear at the last Environment Ministers meeting, the very different opinions, because certain countries see the whole problem, the whole issue, in a completely different way. And another reason, I think, was that we, as the Europeans, are not quite as good as we claim to be. We've got the joint implementation measures and the CDMs, and if we were to take those out and then sort of calculate everything on the basis of our own CO2 emissions, then I think overall we're not quite as good, as I said, as we claim to be. And then thirdly, if you take a look at countries in other regions of the world, they approach the problem from a different angle. We want a legally binding agreement, but China and the US have a different approach. And I think we ought to give some thought to whether we want to introduce a little more flexibility into the negotiations, because this is a common fight against this phenomenon, against climate change, and that's what we have to bear in mind.
2 minutos tiene ahora.
Thank you, Mr. Saber. Mr. Jørgensen for 2 minutes, please. Thank you, President. I have a question for the skeptics on climate change who are here. If 9 teachers out of 10 tell you that they're 90% certain that you're ill and they have something that'll make you better if you take it, would you take it? I think you probably would. And the same thing goes for our planet and the diagnosis that we're making of that. And that's the way we should have responded when more than 90% of researchers have been telling us that climate change, global warming, are realities, and they are due to the activities of human beings. We have to act. We can criticize China, we can criticize the US because they didn't have the requisite political commitment in Copenhagen. But here, in this House, we should criticize the lack of initiative in the EU. The EU should have done something, and we need to do something before Mexico. We need to reduce emissions and move that reduction from 30 to 40% by 2020, and we need to commit ourselves financially. We need to come up with costed figures and make sure that the least developed countries are able to meet the challenge and adapt to climate change. And we have to speak with one voice. That's the only way we can have any impact, because if we are going to negotiate in a sensible, straightforward way, that's the only way we can make progress. Mr. Callanan from the Conservatives said that it would be crazy to revise our ambitions up. It would be crazy not to do it, in my opinion, Mr. President. Thank you.
Yes, senor.
Thank you, Mr. Jørgensen, says the President. Our next speaker is Mrs. Lena Ek for 2 minutes, please.
Tack, herr talman.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Copenhagen summit was clearly a disappointment. But now it is important to look to the future. At least that is what we Liberals are doing. We hope that Europe will do so too. We need a post-Copenhagen strategy and agenda. We have to continue to place our bets on the emissions trading system is the only possibility, and we have to try to work together with the United States to establish a transatlantic market in emissions trading. I think you are absolutely right, Mr. Rehn, in your conclusion. The European Union must speak with one voice in climate negotiations. However, the Parliament now has a lot more to say on the subject than in the past under the Lisbon Treaty. In the final agreement, if there is a final agreement, it will need the endorsement of the European Parliament. We mustn't forget that. So we need to try to emphasize the importance of emissions trading. We need to reduce emissions as well, develop new technologies, and we have to try to set a price on emissions. We need to try to go for these kinds of measures because red tape has just led to more global warming. We need to find appropriate measures and focus on the Europe 2020 targets. We need to make proposals to increase energy efficiency. We need to find good proposals as well when it comes to energy technologies, their promotion, and a climate change strategy. And finally, the 30% has clearly to be the objective if we want to achieve any real results. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Ek. 1.5 minutes for Jadot.
Ça marche? Oui.
Is it working? Madam Minister, I was very surprised to hear this degree of self-satisfaction that you expressed when it came to what the European Union is doing when it comes to climate action. We've probably done more in the past 10 years than other countries, but the European leadership, I think, was a failure at Copenhagen. At Copenhagen, we saw that Europe was basically just the addition of personal communication strategies on the part of the heads of state and government, and I'd like to refer specifically to Mr. Sarkozy, Mrs. Merkel, and obviously it is very easy to point the finger of blame at the UN system, where you have agreements that don't say very much, but you have a lot of grandstanding. And I think over the next few years, the European Union, Europe is going to have to do more and better. We're at a level of 20%, and 20% is to do to make less effort over the next 10 years than we had made over the last 10 years, and that's reducing the EU effort. Which means that that's ridiculous. It's totally absurd when it comes to climate, but it's ridiculous also when it comes to our economy and our jobs. The Minister, please, do not reduce the EU ambitions for the climate and just strive to achieve the smallest common denominator. The speech of President Barroso, who said they don't want to move away from 20%, or even look at the Polish and Italian positions. We ought to adopt the 30% straight away unconditionally. Thank you very much, Mr. Jadot. 1 minute for Mr. Szymański.
Panie Przewodniczący, Panie i Panowie, musimy się pogodzić z faktem.
Thank you, President. Ladies and gentlemen, nobody except for 1 or 2 European countries are willing to pay for a reduction in CO2 emissions or limit their energy use. Things are actually getting worse because some developing countries using anti-colonial rhetoric want to make money by trading in CO2. African countries, China, India want to maintain exceptions. They don't want to be subject to emission controls, and at the same time they want to continue to receive millions and millions of euros. We can't allow this situation to continue. Our taxpayers won't allow us. We can't keep paying the bill by ourselves. First of all, if we act by ourselves, will simply slow down our economies even more and adversely affect the well-being of our citizens. Secondly, if we act alone, we won't actually change anything because we've done as much as we possibly can. Thank you.
Gracias, colega.
Thank you very much. I'd now like to hand the floor to Mr. Hoarau for 1 minute.
Oui, merci, Monsieur le Président, Madame la Ministre.
Thank you, President. Minister, colleagues, if Copenhagen was a failure, the mobilization of non-state actors was exceptional and did lead to the emergence of a genuine planetary commitment to solidarity. It is clear that the negotiations that will now unfold have to take into account the interests of small, vulnerable island states and of Africa. We also need to ensure that the 100 billion euros announced in Copenhagen are genuinely fresh money on top of public development aid. Finally, we must realize that we have very little time left before the consequences of climate change become irreversible. The year 2010 will be our last chance to achieve a genuine success in Mexico.
Elie.
Thank you very much, Elie. I'd now like to hand the floor to Mr. Esther de Rossi for 1 minute.
I think we've been warned. The resolution voted in this Parliament was simply asking for too much, and we end up getting nothing. It's not just my Lega party that's saying this, but the UN conference itself said that the agreement's just a kind of letter of intent. Basically, nothing was achieved despite a marathon negotiation which is more or less unlimited and unprecedented in length, and the Copenhagen Agreement reached with between Indians, Chinese, the United States and South Africa hasn't even been formally adopted. The 192 participating states, in fact there were 8 countries who formed a blocking minority, just noted the agreement. Since December we have seen in our papers and the TV showing us that Europe is in the grip of cold. Let's stop speculating pointlessly on the climate. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rossi. Mrs. Wertmann for 1 minute. Thank you, President. Dear colleagues, the only specific result of the climate summit in Copenhagen was that global warming is to be limited to 2 degrees centigrade, and the measures necessary were not really prepared and designed. And this compromise result is a bit of a disappointment to us, because it's left up to individual states and countries to adopt the agreement on emissions reductions or not. But time is pressing, and it's up to us now to decide how we proceed. And we have to promote developments which are kind to the environment and respect the climate, and allow us to use the resources of the earth in a responsible way. And it's to our benefit and to the benefit of future generations. And I think the European Union, the member states, is really going to have to build up on its leadership role when it comes to green technologies, and at least then we will have made a start. Thank you very much. I'd now like to give Mrs. Dati speaking time for 2 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Thank you, Mr. President. Minister, Commissioner, well, it's escaped nobody that we missed the opportunity at Copenhagen, but nevertheless, Commissioner, that it had 2 virtues. First of all, it mobilized far more heads of state and government than Kyoto, and the second merit of Copenhagen was that we did obtain financial commitments in favor of emerging countries to help them fight against climate change. So what should the EU do now? Clearly, we should continue to demonstrate excellence by reducing greenhouse gas emissions. At the same time, Europe has already been extremely virtuous with regard to the Kyoto objective, which was an 8% reduction. We are not far off 13% on behalf of our European businesses. So we have shown great commitment to environmental protection, but we shouldn't allow for unfair competition in our endeavours, Mr. Rehn. So we have to set example, but in a situation of fair competition. We need to ask questions about the implementation of the carbon border tax at the frontiers of the EU. We cannot abandon our businesses defenceless against unfair competition and, of course, thereby lose jobs, and giving the competitive advantage to companies who have no environmental commitments and no greenhouse gas emission reductions. So, Commissioner, and here I would echo Corinne LEPAGE, at some point you have to look at the implementation of a border tax on carbon at the frontiers of the EU. Moreover, I should say that I was delighted that Commissioner Tajani in his hearing said that he wasn't ruling out the possibility of a feasibility study on this carbon border tax. So I think gradually we're going to win that fight, because it's important to protect both our businesses and jobs in Europe.
Thank you, Mrs. Dati. 2 minutes for Mrs. Anni PODIMATA.
Thank you, President. Commissioner, the discussion has to look at various issues as we try to look at a world-binding agreement and decide what we do in Europe for our next steps. Unfortunately, the outcome of Copenhagen was far below expectations and not up to the circumstances. That's the first reason why we're expressing our disappointment. The second reason why we are disappointed, and affects us particularly in this European Parliament, is the poor show that Europe put up in Copenhagen. In the first World Conference where the European Union took part after the Treaty of Lisbon came into force, we would have expected a more ambitious attempt from Europe to come up with a world agreement to combat climate change. But what we saw, along with the citizens of Europe, of course, was that Europe was divided. Some leaders were playing their own game, and that the European Union simply looked divided and weak. That's not the role that we want, or the role we ought to be playing. What should we do then, Mr. President? We call upon the Commission and the Council to come up to the mark, to play a proper leading role, and we need to make sure that Europe tries this again. It's not simply a question of trying to mitigate the consequences of climate change. We need to change towards a new model of development, green development. That's the model that has to be part of Europe's answer as we try to generate new jobs, to strengthen competitiveness in the European economy, and also to establish a European leading role in the next round of negotiations. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. I'd now like to hand the floor to Mrs. Fiona Hall for 2 minutes.
The outcome of Copenhagen was deeply disappointing, but we must now move forward. The EU needs to commit itself now to a 30% cut in emissions for 3 reasons. The first is simply that a 30% cut requires now barely more effort than the original 20% cut, simply because of the fall in economic activity due to the recession. Secondly, to rein back now would be to lose the momentum which has been built up in the new green industries. We cannot half commit to investment in renewable energy sources and low carbon transport. There is massive infrastructure which needs to be put in place, whether it's a North Sea supergrid or, on a smaller scale, plug-in charging points for electric cars. Hundreds and thousands of new jobs are at stake, potentially 70,000 jobs relating to offshore wind in the UK alone. But these jobs, so necessary for economic recovery, will only be realised if there's a clear roadmap towards a zero-carbon Europe by 2050. Investment has to have certainty. And we need to be aware that Europe is in danger of losing its place as leader on renewable technology. Both the US and China are growing their renewables industries very rapidly. If we hesitate now, those new green jobs will move to other continents. Finally, we need that 30% cut because most of the extra commitment can easily be realised by increased energy efficiency. Not to do more on energy efficiency would in any case be crazy. Energy efficiency means economic efficiency, it means lower energy bills, not higher ones, and it improves energy security. So whatever figures are put on the table by the other parties on the 31st of January, and maybe we will be pleasantly surprised, the EU must commit now to a 30% cut. Thank you.
Gracias, señora Hall.
Thank you, Mrs. Hall. And now 1 minute to Mr. Strejček.
Pane předsedo, dámy a pánové, na hodnocení kodaňského summitu a...
Thank you, President. Ladies and gentlemen, in order to be able to properly assess the Copenhagen summit, then you need a lot of common good sense and I think a lot of reliable environmental and economic data which would prove to you that there is no global warming, but if there is, then that this, I think, is beyond the realms of mankind to be able to influence this. Last week we heard that a lot of the environmental data that the international panel was working with had either been was either fraudulent or was misinterpreted. So it's hardly surprising that we didn't have a more positive outcome in Copenhagen. And I think this is perhaps a result of an aggressive green policy being implemented. And we really ought to be focusing on the real problems that are important for our citizens. Then, of course, if we were to continue on this path, we would stop throwing away our taxpayers' money. And fourthly, I think we ought to have a more sensible discussion about how we can get cheaper access to energies and perhaps focus on nuclear energy. Ladies and gentlemen, when I talk to my voters, they're very surprised at the kind of issues we discuss here without focusing on their own real problems.
Gracias, colega. Tiene un minuto ahora.
Thank you. I'd now like to hand the floor for 1 minute to Mrs. Marisa Matias.
Thank you, President. What we saw in Copenhagen were in fact steps backwards rather than forwards. We saw more unity in some areas than there was in Kyoto, but also more division. And that we had a kind of every man for himself situation where states are free to select their own methods to deal with matters on a voluntary basis. The idea of the 2-degree limit on temperature increase wasn't really achieved, and I think that what we need to do is look to the future, and we need to simply forget about rhetoric and move to deeds. Europe has always talked a good game, but when it came to Copenhagen we didn't even defend the goals which it had set for itself. So I hope that for the future we can act in a better way and make sure that the failed decisions of Copenhagen don't mean that the poorest people in the world continue to pay for our mistakes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd now like to hand the floor to Mr. Soini for 1 minute.
Arvoisa herra puhemies, Kööpenhaminan
Thank you, Mr. President. The Copenhagen Conference was a complete failure. I was against this proposal, as others were, and I was right. The EU tried to impose its model on the whole world, but just a few days before it was clear that €5 billion had been misused in the emissions trading system. And this was clear just a few days before the Copenhagen summit, and that was a real disgrace for the EU. Did the EU not bother to study what had happened, what had gone wrong there before pushing for our further restriction of emissions? It doesn't make sense for us to just get rid of our industry, for example, in Finland. I mean, that goes against the interests of our workers.
Gracias.
Thank you very much. I'd now like to hand the floor to Mrs. Jordan Cizeli for 2 minutes.
Ladies and gentlemen,
For me too, the Copenhagen conference was a disappointment, but let us stop complaining about the bad results and let us ask where to go from here so that we will not be disappointed once again. It is not enough to just say we will continue our work because something needs to be changed. My first question is, what are the COP conferences in the first place? Are they serious conferences or just a show for the public? Probably they're both, but we have to ensure that the work of experts will be carried out and that the public will be informed about the serious work, not only about the informal events that take place in parallel with the conference. So Europe should ask the question, how are these conferences organized? My second question is, what is the role of global leaders in these conferences? Are they just working on the election campaign or are they working on compromise? I believe we should ask the question about the working methods at conferences and about the role of global leaders. And my third question is EU leadership. Yes, we do have a lot of good measures in order for Europe to maintain its leadership role in green technologies, but we have lost a leading role in the negotiation process. It is not enough that we accept only our coordinating role. No, we have to be an active player, an active negotiator. And for this to happen, we cannot simply put all our cards on the table before the conference even starts. We have to try to approach third countries and not get more distant from them. And my last point is, our international meetings should always include the issue of climate change. And here I expect the cooperation of both commissioners that are competent for this area. Thank you.
Gracias.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Jordan Cizeli. I'd now like to hand the floor to Mr. Enrique Guerrero for 2 minutes. Thank you, President, Minister, Commissioner. Today, and right at the beginning of the year 2010, we aren't really where we would like to have arrived in our fight against climate change. And the reason we haven't got that far is because, well, basically we should be actually taking a look at the program of legislative changes that should have stemmed from an agreement in Copenhagen. We haven't got that far, and I think this is a good reason for us being rather disappointed, because we had our own ambitions when it came to the fight against climate change, and those have been somewhat disappointed. We don't have a binding agreement, and there was a lack of transparency in the whole procedure. And this means that we don't have the necessary legal base nor the necessary means to be able to cater for the expectations, in particular in the developing countries. But I think nor are we in the same place as we were before Copenhagen, because we did manage to achieve an agreement in Copenhagen with South Africa, China, the United States and Brazil setting out certain targets, and then other countries came along and joined this agreement: Norway, Sweden, Russia, Spain, other countries as well. So if you take a look at all of those countries together, they do account for 75% of CO2 emissions, nor should we forget that very many of these countries were outside the Kyoto Protocol. So maybe the step hasn't been big enough, but I think it was quite a significant step forward. And that's the one that we have to make the most of in order to give some kind of impulse from within the European Union. We have made headway, and that's based on a motor in the European Union. And unless the European Union doesn't continue to push this and to give a boost to this, we're not going to make any more progress. So we need to work towards getting binding agreements in Mexico and making sure that we have the necessary means and resources that will help the developing countries mitigate their emissions and to have a technology transfer. And we have to do this for the reasons of fairness and justice, and to bring allies on board. And I'm quite sure the Spanish presidency will work towards this end.
Señor Guerrero.
Mr. Guerrero. Mr. Marcinkiewicz has indicated to us that he would like to put a question. Are you willing to accept his question? Yes, yes. Mr. Marcinkiewicz, you can put your question very briefly, please, to your question to Mr. Guerrero.
Ja chciałem zadać pytanie w formule.
Yes, I'd like to put a question But at the end of the statements, in the catch the eye procedure.
Sorry. I do apologise, Mr. Marcinkiewicz. There was a slight misunderstanding, because what we understood was that you wished to put a question according to the blue card rule. I'd now like to hand the floor to Mr. Helmer for 1 minute.
President, I have good news for the House. In common with many scientists, I personally have concluded that there is no climate crisis. Global sea levels are not rising significantly, and as the IPCC has been forced to admit, Himalayan glaciers are not in rapid retreat. The small increase in mean global temperatures over the last 100 years is entirely consistent with well-established long-term natural climate changes. Copenhagen showed that many nations, especially China and India, are simply not prepared to sacrifice economic performance to solve an entirely speculative problem. In Britain, a majority of voters no longer believe in man-made climate change, and they won't pay for futile and pointless attempts at mitigation. The recent leaked CRU memos show that even the high priests of climate alarmism are in despair at the failure of nature to follow their forecasts, so they're falsifying the figures to sustain their fantasy. We must now demand a full public inquiry into the suspect data before we spend another penny on mitigation.
Helmer. Thank you very much, Mr. Helmer. I'd now like to hand the floor to Mr. Ferreira for 1 minute.
Thank you, President. The failure of Copenhagen meant that the two biggest emitters, the US and then the EU, have heavy responsibilities, and they're simply trying to pass the buck, and that won't do. It failed as far as financing for adaptation for the developing countries. There weren't enough commitments entered into, and at the same time we continue hypocritically to close our eyes because of the huge external debt, which in fact, compared with the financing that's been announced, is absolutely gigantic and will prevent any kind of sustainable social and economic development in these countries. The perverse results of the Kyoto Protocol and flexibility and our financial system are basically the cause of the failure, and we're trying to tackle the impact but not the causes of the whole thing anyway, and that is why we have so many problems and we can't sort them out. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ferreira. I'd now like to hand the floor to Mr. Royal for 2 minutes.
Mr. President, colleagues, in the Copenhagen Agreement we have the 2 degrees accepted but not bindingly, and there's very little left of the objectives we set ourselves. Things went wrong in Copenhagen. I think you can call it a failure, a defeat, and I think we need to precisely describe the situation as it is if you are to have an opportunity of thoroughly understanding the reasons for this and then being able to move ahead on the substance. I'm rather shocked by what some people have said this afternoon, saying, you know, we should just go on regardless, try and achieve more percentage points, try and get more money. It was just a problem of a lack of unity in Europe. I think that's too superficial an analysis of what happened. Just carry on regardless, keep marching in the same direction. That isn't the solution. The reasons for the failure were different. Did we really fairly and soberly consider all of the things that were necessary? How did we deal with colleagues' questions, justified or unjustified, who were critical, who were sceptical about climate change? How did we in the Climate Committee treat people who said we want to look at the alternative position of the dissenting scientists? And I think one has at least to calmly discuss these matters, regardless of what your position is. You have to discuss how you deal with the points that some colleagues have just raised about the mistakes that have been made about retreat of glaciers, for example. And also, what about the instruments that we're using? Are we right to go for new timetables, new percentage targets, this rather bureaucratic approach? Or isn't Mrs. Ek right when she emphasized the fact that technology and innovation is the way that will help us forward? Other states are adopting other routes. It's not as if they're doing nothing. And so perhaps we need a little bit more open-mindedness. We need to reflect a little bit more if we are to achieve something on the substance. This is what I would like to see, rather than just sort of shut our eyes and keep going regardless.
Thank you. 1.5 minutes for Mrs. Merkies.
President, Mr. President, Madam Minister, I do not want to depict a doom scenario as being done here. I do not want to depict a doom scenario for the future, nor do I want to look back in anger about the failure of Copenhagen, although I am angry. Therefore, 3 solutions to do far better in the future, the next opportunity being Mexico this year. 1. Do not walk alone next time, for in Copenhagen we looked back and we stood alone in our ambitions. We must be able to convince others to be as ambitious as we are, because how do we want to claim to be in the driver's seat if we fail to convince others of our ambitions and of the destination? 2, no one size fits all. As sometimes proudly said during the running up in the climate summit, there is no plan B. Well, don't we know it? There's nothing right now. We do have nothing. So we better have a plan B next time. And last but not least, how can we win in diversity if our slogan is, unity? And we better unite next time, and that is one voice. We need a univocal mandate. Europe needs really one voice. So you, Madam Minister, Presidency, are you willing to commit yourselves to obtain an exclusive and not a shared mandate? So an exclusive competence for the European Union in climate policy and climate agreements. Thank you.
Gracias, colega.
Thank you, Madam. And I give the floor to Mr. Piotrowski.
Thank you very much, President. Climate and nature are the asset for all of us and for future generations, so we must feel responsible for their protection. At the past climate summit, the leaders of states couldn't agree on a common strategy and tools to achieve it. Paradoxically, I think this is not bad news in the light of information coming from the UK and the United States on manipulation with scientific data in order to achieve a concrete result, what is done by some lobbying groups. We need a credible analysis of the situation. That is why I appeal to establish an independent expert group, international expert group, that will prepare a report whether the actions by human beings really impact climate and whether the data is credible. EU politicians establishing their common strategy should also take account of economic differences between West and East European member states, because in the light of crisis it may ruin many economies. Thank you.
Gracias, colega.
Thank you, sir. I now give the floor to Mrs. Carvalho for 2 minutes. Mr. President, Minister, the Copenhagen conference ended up with a result far from what was expected or wanted. Member states took note of the document and saw that the objectives are non-binding. This summit was far more than a climate summit. We were talking about or discussing a new balance of power in the world, the multilateralism of UN. The voice of emerging nations was heard stronger, and I think the Copenhagen conference showed that we've got to rethink Europe's role in the world. Perhaps we should use what is available to us under the Lisbon Treaty so as to prepare for the next conference of parties. We need to speak together with one voice and forge strategic alliances. So Copenhagen is the basis for further work. The European Union has to ensure that the next steps in negotiations develop the Copenhagen Agreement towards a binding legal agreement and do so by the end of the year.
We also need to contribute towards the implementation of measures relative to funding for developing countries, technology transfer, protection of forests and adaptation measures. Internally, the European Union has its work cut out for it. It needs to implement the climate and energy package, investing in clean technologies, investing in research, energy efficiency, and working towards a new industrial policy based on efficiency of national resources and innovation, promoting low-carbon cities and sustainable mobility and transports. Only that way we'll be able to show leadership, because real leadership is based on example. Thank you very much.
Gracias.
Thank you, Madam. I now give the floor to Mr. Tabajdi for a minute and a half.
Muchas gracias.
President, the Copenhagen summit showed that the EU could not find partners for its commitments. Future targets, the 2020 commitments, should not be given up, but we have to rethink our negotiating mandate and negotiating positions. There are some conclusions to be drawn and lessons to be learned. That negotiating mandate was not successful. We simply did not understand the real position of China. We overestimated the room for maneuver available to President Obama, and we did not have a united voice. As Mr. Verheugen rightly said, Europe was lacking in a united voice. We can't hide away. We simply cannot continue the same way after Copenhagen as before. Before the Mexico summit, we have to come up with a new negotiating mandate. We have to look at the outcome of the Copenhagen summit. In other words, the 2-degree goal, and we have to revise the tools at our disposal as to how we can achieve those objectives. We need to define a flexible negotiating position.
Thank you. And now give the floor to Mrs. de Lange for 2 minutes.
Ja, dank u wel, voorzitter. Mevrouw
Thank you, President. Madam Minister, today in the Netherlands, in schools, we are aware of climate change. This has been discussed in my constituency, and they've discussed the rise in sea level at schools. And I must say that the debate makes me realize that Copenhagen was not a success, and of course you can point an accusatory finger at certain countries or certain sectors, but I think it would be better to try to see what can be done so that Europe can face up to its responsibilities, and so that at international level we can reach an agreement. And the option of 30% reduction in emissions has been put on the table, and we'll have to see how we can do this at European level. It's not simply enough to say that agriculture is a problem, because it can also be a source of energy. We need to use science and knowledge as a basis. Many colleagues have said that we should speak with one single voice. In Mexico, there should only be one seat for Europe, and not several different seats as in Copenhagen. So, Madam Minister, how, with the commissioners, will you be organizing the Copenhagen meeting?
Muchas gracias. Thank you very much, Madam. And now give the floor to Mrs. Childers for 1.5 minutes.
The hope generated by years of preparation descended into despondency and despair as it became increasingly clear that the deal we had come to agree in Copenhagen was slipping from our grasp as each day passed. We must be concerned about how easy it was for the US, China and others to circumvent the UN structures, sideline the EU and agree an arrangement which fell far short of global expectations. One thing is clear, the UN climate talk system needs life-saving surgery before Mexico at the end of this year. As it stands, President Obama is a prisoner of his political system, where he needs 67 votes in the Senate. China refuses all measures which would be binding and open to international scrutiny. The irony of the situation is this. The longer the US, China and others frustrate, delay and prevaricate on a deal, the tougher the targets for reduction will of necessity become. But let's look at solutions. The EU and this Parliament needs to honestly examine how it approaches such matters in the future. Europe must be much more assertive in standing up for itself, and in doing so should continue to set ambitious targets involving targets in emissions reductions of 30%. Mr. President, this is an economic race to lead the world into the 21st century based on green jobs and sustainable living. Europe must win that race regardless of what our friends do or don't do.
Gracias, colega.
Thank you, Madam. I now give the floor to Mrs. Gutierrez Cortines for 2 minutes. Thank you very much, Mr. President. Welcome to the Minister. It's nice to see you here. I feel very concerned at the changing attitudes that may ensue from the Copenhagen Agreement. The first problem we have is that we need to be far more humble and realistic. Other colleagues have made this point. But when we've gone to other countries, these countries don't talk about climate change, they talk about global changes. The backdrop in Mexico, and indeed the backdrop now, is growing population, the need for more agriculture, the need for more food, limited resources of land and water, and any decision we take on climate change has to take account of this context. And these countries also have the right to develop, so we need to have an overall systemic vision, and that is of course sadly lacking in debate on climate change. We shouldn't look at climate change from an angle of emissions. It's a biased approach. Is unhelpful here and elsewhere. I think we've got to attach greater importance to science, and all those teams that have fudged the data should have their funding taken away from them if they're EU funded. Now, how are we going to engage in coordination? That's another very important point. How is Europe going to get its act together and reach agreement? That's what we've got to get started on right now. And the final issue I am concerned now. We need a new strategic vision of the territory, and that's going to include things like reforestation, strategic regions devoted to agro-energy and of course biodiversity, and we lack that big picture vision. We've got to think about the possibility of structural funds for new strategic plans in all regions so that we can make the necessary adaptation. And where the decision makers were brought in this revision, because we don't have responsibility in this field, it's going to be very difficult to do anything at all in Europe. Thank you.
Gracias, colega. Tiene palabra por 1 minuto.
Thank you very much. El Khadraoui has 1.5 minutes.
Thank you, President. Colleagues, a lot has been said that the summit failed. It was a long way from our objectives. Like others, I would like to say that we can correct a lot of things ourselves without a global agreement. We can do things in terms of sustainable transport systems. In the objectives, it is supposed that emissions from aviation emissions should come down by 10%. That is thought to be possible. Also, the IMO thinks the same for maritime transport. I think, apart from those negotiations with the organizations, we need to prepare measures, unilateral measures, if agreements aren't possible in the short term. There are lots of things that can be done as well. in terms of internal transport in the EU. And I think we ought to be ambitious in that area. Transport represents 25% of emissions, so it's urgent to tackle this area. It's complicated. We need a whole range of complicated measures, but this sector can contribute to a sustainable policy.
Gracias.
Thank you, sir. And now for 2 minutes, I give the floor to Mrs. Soulier.
Merci, Monsieur le Président, Madame la Ministre.
Thank you, President, Madam Minister, colleagues. The importance of the question of climate change no longer needs to be proved. Its impact on the short, medium and long term are undeniable, although the results, as described in a certain newspaper today, have hit the headlines and reinforced the position of the skeptics. The summit of Copenhagen looked like a unique opportunity for world leaders to bear witness, to take action and to correct the effects of climate change. The European Union was in a leading position thanks to our audacious legislation on the limitation of the impact of our activities on the planet, but also because Europe represents a union of countries which can really make a difference. The outcome of the Copenhagen summit leaves us dissatisfied, but I don't think we should talk about a failure. The world agreed on the question of the restriction of an increase in temperature to 2 degrees, even for the most reluctant countries such as China. And Brazil has just produced a law on reducing greenhouse gases by 39% by the year 2020, and others have proved very ambitious about the objectives of reducing greenhouse gases. I'm thinking about Japan and Norway. In addition to that, we should emphasize the very positive point, which was the consensus achieved on the urgent need for a mechanism for the effects of deforestation. A specific unanimous text was achieved and to reduce deforestation and to permit the natural storage of CO2. Far from a binding agreement, but nonetheless a political agreement, the outcome of Copenhagen should lead us to ask ourselves about the reasons for this disappointment. I went to Copenhagen, as did many colleagues. We wanted to take part and help Europe to take action and to play a leading role. I was very disappointed because Europe didn't have the seat it should have occupied in negotiations. Particularly, that is true of the European Parliament. Europe must show that it is stronger on this subject. The ministers of the environment meeting in Seville did not reach any conclusions, and we are still divided regarding the objectives. I hope that with the proposals and with these commitments, the Committee for the Environment will put the Union's ambitions back on the agenda.
Thank you very much. 2 minutes for Mr. Van Nistelrooy. Thank you very much, Mr. President. I'd like to point out that I'm a member of the CDA delegation. Now, I'd like to put a question to the Minister, if I may. Look, the implementation of the treaty is undoubtedly going to be important. Now, we've drawn up a series of rules, and what impact are they going to have? That's my question. As a coordinator for regional policy, I'd like to remind you that our aims cannot be modified or amended. The contribution of cities, towns and citizens is hugely important. This can't be called into question at any point. Climate change is hugely important, and that's something where we see reflected in the new Commission's 2020 strategy. I think that the European Union has a raft of instruments and means at its disposal which it needs to deploy. 30% of regional funds go to climate-related and energy-related projects. I believe that this will also allow us to foster innovation, green technologies, and a whole raft of similar issues which I think will put Europe in the vanguard of the world. As for the recovery programme, to fight against the economic crisis, well, surely between that and the other project I've talked about, we will have laid the groundwork for all that needs to be done in this field. I think that regions and cities need to play an important role, far greater role in all of this process. And I think we would be sending out the wrong signal if we were not to respect the role of cities and regions. I hope, sincerely, that in Mexico things will turn out far better. Thank you, sir. And now I give the floor to Mr. Adder for 1.5 minutes.
Thank you, President. We shouldn't embellish the picture. Copenhagen was a failure indeed. But I wouldn't like to focus on this failure, but rather would dwell upon our own tasks. We have to understand that one of the reasons for the failure was that there was no single European position forged out and pinned down in Copenhagen, neither in the CO2 quotas nor in terms of funding. I agree with those who say that the basis for successful negotiations should be a single European position. That is true. What should we need in order to arrive to such a single position? Well, both the Commission and all member states of the EU should adhere to the letter and spirit of Kyoto. Hungary, Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, the Baltic states, Slovakia and the Czech Republics have delivered beyond their Kyoto commitments. Therefore, they are given the opportunity to sell their CO2 quotas. It is not fair and it is not correct and not just from the Commission and from other member states to deprive these countries from this opportunity. In Copenhagen, Poland and Hungary have tabled a compromise proposal which would retain the quota sales, the opportunity to sell quotas beyond 2012, but only limited amounts could be marketed and revenue should be spent on green investments. We tabled a compromise solution in order to arrive at a single European position. Now it is up to the Commission and the 15 member states, also because Hungary, Poland, Romania and other Central Eastern European countries, without them, the 15 old member states could not say that we have delivered on our commitments, because they would be only at 5.5% instead of the 8%.
Thank you, sir. I now give the floor to Mrs. Grosstedt, also for 1.5 minutes.
Thank you very much, President. The negotiations have shown the failure of the Union strategy, which has taken others in its wake. There has been a gulf between the rhetoric about being a leader and the ability of Europe to take others along in the negotiations. Nobody followed us, but the defeat was certain. In fact, the European Union was hardly audible in the negotiations. What can we do now? In order to put in place the principle of reciprocity with third countries, we can't accept a situation with products which don't respect the standards. So the failure of Copenhagen has created uncertainty in terms of the international standards for reducing emissions, which is to the detriment of our companies which want to invest. The lack of visibility will affect the market in CO2, which requires a clear framework. At the same time, the US, China are making huge investments in green technology for the world of tomorrow. Now we must have a true industrial policy within Europe, because the real issue, that is the real issue in fighting climate change. This new technology, clean technology, exists, and we must employ that for the benefit of all, mostly vis-à-vis developing countries. We have the means to succeed in this revolution, but let's be more pragmatic in the next negotiations, so that we can transfer this into something legally binding in Mexico next time.
Mrs. Grostet, I didn't want to cut you off. You were speaking extremely quickly. But anyway, I allowed you to conclude. And I give the floor to Mr. Grzyb for 1.5 minutes.
Grazie, signor Presidente. Pani Minister.
Madam Minister, Commissioner, Spanish presidency decided to make the assessment of the conference in Copenhagen, which was a failure. But failure doesn't mean real failure. It may be a beginning of future success. We must look for the reasons and assess the strategy, negotiating strategy of the EU in the field of climate change, because we are getting ready to the summit in Mexico in December this year. Should we increase the reduction objective and goal, because they so far haven't been achieved? Well, we don't have partners for the current goal, so perhaps there will be no one to support us for even higher reduction, and without India, China and especially the United States, we will not be able to achieve this goal in Mexico like it happened in Copenhagen. We should assess declarations of other parties and first of all treat the forum of the international conference as the main forum for negotiations. We want green economy. We want rational use of the environment. We want new energy sources, new technologies, and we want to save energy. And at the same time, we know that the cheapest energy is the energy that we are not using. So rationality, and my final sentence, reduction of CO2 emissions and the emissions of other greenhouse gases will not be achieved by new technologies. Also, soil and forests may absorb CO2 effectively. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Now, unlike this morning, when we ran out of time and fell very far behind, today, or rather this afternoon, we have a little extra time at our disposal, so I'll break with convention and rules and try to give everybody who's asked to speak under the catch-the-eye procedure. I would, however, ask you all to abide by the 1-minute rule. We'll cut you off after you have spoken for a minute. There are 13 speakers on the list, and I'd like everyone to be able to speak, but if the Commissioner and the Minister are to react, you must respect the 1-minute rule. First of all, Mr. Marinescu. Thank you very much, President. As people expected, there were no specific or tangible results from Copenhagen, but we were clear on global warming. The European Union must continue to make every effort on foreign policy on this front, particularly in discussions with the United States and China. We need real results. We've got a Commissioner for Foreign Policy and a Commissioner for Climate Change, but at the moment the European Union has acted unilaterally, and that has to be further pursued. I hope that the informal meeting in Seville will allow environment ministers to take a pragmatic look at the Copenhagen results and come up with a plan for 2010-2014. Similarly, the third package of measures necessary for the internal market to energy needs to be properly coordinated so that we can ensure the energy security and particularly so we can develop carbon capture and storage technologies. Yes, Mrs. McAvan now.
Thank you, Mr. President. Madam President of Council, just a question, and maybe the Commission as well, about this deadline of January the 31st. What is happening about the pledges inside the EU? I mean, I assume the EU would make one pledge, but I'm hearing that in COEPA they're discussing several pledges. What exactly is happening? And secondly, we talk about one voice for Europe, but isn't part of the problem that the EU went to Copenhagen with a mandate and there was no flexibility for the negotiating team to negotiate, because And that is part of the problem, and that's why the EU is cut out of the final negotiations, because why talk to a negotiator who cannot move at all, has no flexibility? And how are we going to resolve this? I'm told the same thing happens at the WTO. It's a big problem for the EU. And finally, I hope, Commissioner Rehn, you will pass on our best wishes to Commissioner Dimas. I'm sorry he's not here for the final session. We would have liked to thank him for the excellent work he's done over many years, and I hope we will see him next week in the Environment Committee to pass on our thanks.
Tiene la palabra ahora.
Mr. Gerbrandy has the floor.
Voorzitter, dank u wel.
Thank you. The giants in Copenhagen were the USA, China, India and Brazil, and we had no European giants. We had 28 dwarfs, 27 member states and a commission without any power. And so Europe wasn't able to play the role it should have played. That's a great shame for Europe, but it's also a shame for a conference of this type. This morning, President Barroso told us, with his hand on the Lisbon Treaty, that the Commission would be speaking on behalf of the Union on the environment. Well, let him do so. It's not a matter of just rhetoric. If necessary, we should ignore the Council. Thank you. John Honey.
Is this on yet? Whilst the big conference at Copenhagen was underway last month, complete with politicians, NGOs and activists, there was another climate conference going on in the same city, where most of the speakers were scientists, and I believe that I was the only MEP present. These scientists, one by one, demolished the so-called facts about man-made global warming with scientific argument as opposed to alarmist soundbite. We heard about the technical failures of Al Gore's hockey stick graph and the unreliability of weather station data after the fall of the Berlin Wall. We were advised on the scientific shortcomings of the computer models that are reluctant to predict cold weather, and the probability of the opposite relationship between carbon dioxide and global temperatures to the one that we are being brainwashed with. We were shown satellite photographs of the rapid increase in Arctic ice over the last 3 years, and we were briefed on the increase in the numbers of polar bears.
La palabra el señor.
Thank you. Mr. Brons has the floor.
The earlier references to the so-called evidence about Himalayan glaciers need to be elaborated on. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change said in 2007 that they would disappear by the year 2035. The Sunday Times has recently discovered that the report was ultimately based on an interview given to the New Scientist by an Indian scientist, Mr. Hasnain, in 1999. Mr. Hasnain has subsequently said that this was based on personal estimates and did not mention the year and didn't carry out any formal research. If our conclusions on the hypothesis of climate change are to be based on evidence, then that evidence must be irreproachable. It must not be manufactured and it must not be invented. Thank you.
He's not here. Gracias.
Thank you. Mr. Matula, you have the floor.
Mulțumesc, domnule președinte. Spre deosebire de alte regiuni ale lumii, Uniunea Europeană.
Unlike the other regions in the world, the European Union is taking the leading role in fighting climate change. A lot of us were there in Copenhagen, so I hope the number of our allies will win out. The results of the summit weren't the results we wanted, but I think our involvement will have some good results. We can promote programs of investments in member states, investments in renewable energy, and in areas directly involved in producing climate change. These are small projects like assistance programs for local projects, but also big projects, and like waste sorting and wastewater programs.
Palabra el señor.
Thank you. Gilles Parnieu.
Oui. Voilà, Madame.
Minister, on the 11th of November, Václav Havel said, Europe is the homeland of our homelands, but after Copenhagen, our European compatriots are being very tough. There's a loss of confidence taking place. Now, given this crisis in confidence and to try to recover confidence, I'd like to put a two-pronged question to you. First of all, during your 6-month presidency, do you once again wish to discuss and negotiate a Tobin-type tax on carbon emissions? I think that would recover confidence, not just of our compatriots, but also those of the whole world. Secondly, do you also wish to include a more binding list of carbon emission quotas and carbon leakage?
Thank you. Mr. Sean Kelly.
Just as one swallow doesn't make a summer, neither does one cold winter disprove theories of climate change and global warming. Indeed, for more and more people, the evidence is overwhelming, because both the scientific evidence and the visual evidence proves that there is climate change. Now, people have described the Copenhagen conference as a flop and a failure. I think it could be more accurately described as a little step in the right direction, one small step in the right direction. But the challenge now is, in Mexico, to turn that small step into a giant leap for mankind. And for us in particular in the European Union, there's a major challenge, particularly to show that the new institutions and the new positions created in the Lisbon Treaty are effective. If we are marginalised, as happened in Copenhagen, it will be...
Tiene la palabra ahora el señor.
Mr. Perillo.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, President. Few matters are the subject of so much consensus in the European Parliament and society, and we want to meet up to the expectations of society. I don't think that there was a failure of the summit, and we've had a great deal of snow in the north, which shows that there is climate change, but I don't think we should lower our guard. More than ever, we need to maintain a united position, Madam Minister. We should be able to give more stimulus to people and convince the Council that we need a more uniform position, and ask the Commission to see to it that we speak with one voice, so that when we go to Mexico, Mr. Obama cannot say that that there is frustration about the ambitions of the European Union. Thank you.
Gracias.
Thank you. You know that you can hand in what you're saying in writing. If you speak so quickly, the interpreters cannot keep up with you. So you're just listening to yourselves, or the only people who speak the same language can understand you. So it would be advisable for you to allow time for your speech to be interpreted, and you can, as I said, hand in your speech in writing, and it will be included in the verbatim report. Mr. Sonik.
Thank you, Mr. President. Minister, Commissioner, we should deem that the tactics adopted by the EU so far, also at the Copenhagen summit, has been a mistake. It was a tactics in which you show all the cards, and we believe that if we adopt ambitious objectives, others will join in. The auction that we have seen in the European Parliament, whether it would be 40 or 50% of emission reduction was erroneous. It reminded me of the negotiations from the Cold War period, when some political forces believed that unilateral disarmament would cause the Soviet Union to disarm as well. We need to change our strategy. We need to be more decisive in our talks with China and the US, and we need to threaten them with a carbon tax at the border of the EU. Our companies must be competitive in the world. We should also remember about the new technologies.
Tiene la palabra.
Mr. Tarabella has the floor.
Mr. President, we have to admit that the Copenhagen summit was a double failure. If there was a non-binding agreement, and we have to recognize our defeats because it is the role of the two biggest countries in the planet, China and the US, have been highlighted. The G2 shut out the other countries. Now, we have to fight climate change on all fronts. European agriculture is transforming towards sustainable models and better use of water, less use of chemicals, aware that biodiversity and the preservation of ecosystems are the key to reducing environmental pollution. So how will we... Please, speaker cut off.
Palabra ahora el señor Marcinkiewicz.
Mr. Marcinkiewicz.
Panie Przewodniczący.
President, the summit in Copenhagen showed a different view on climate change. The problem really is not to reduce CO2 emissions, but to guarantee effective mechanisms for their reduction. So far, the EU has been the leader in this objective. So it is worth within the EU to suggest a sustainable approach that would allow for funding inside the EU. There should be a fund established in solidarity by all the member states, and they could contribute equally without large complications to this fund, and we would finance those initiatives that would be the most effective.
Thank you. Thank you for not using up all your time. Now, Mr. Gierek.
Because there are so many critical comments among scientists about the credibility of IPCC conclusions, and because of data falsification which did impact Copenhagen, I approached the Commission asking about any possibility to verify those that research. Mr. Dimas said that the assessment of IPCC is a symbol of consensus reached by thousands of scientists. I'm asking whether consensus is the most important thing in science. He also said that the European Commission says that this does not have impact on the conclusions of IPCC. What are the conclusions from falsified data? I think we need impartial research on the impact on CO2. Without scientific credibility, we are going to face another fiasco in Mexico.
Thank you. Mr. Pietikainen.
The next steps from Copenhagen should improve the position and negotiation abilities of the United Nations, not bashing it. We should facilitate the UN to start negotiating on the high-level segment, followed by the head of states, and then to continue drafting in details with civil servants, a bit in the way it is done on the G8s or G20s. And the EU has the interest and capability to push this kind of a change through in the UN system. Secondly, my wish and my hope for the Council and for the new Commission is that now, with the new Lisbon Treaty, the core issue in our foreign policy would be have this kind of a trio of the President of the Commission, a high level of representative and climate change commissioner to go and negotiate on the basis of a single negotiated text.
Última intervención.
Final contribution from Mrs. Estrela.
Thank you, Mr. President. People have already pointed out rightly that the Copenhagen conference was a disappointment, that not even a binding political agreement was adopted. But now I think the time has come to look to the future, and that means preparing properly in political terms for the next conference. The European Union was technically well prepared, but we need to be properly politically prepared for the Mexico conference. And I think the European Union has to recover leadership and speak with one voice. The Lisbon Treaty, I think, will assist us in doing precisely this. It will help Europe to speak with one voice, to speak with the authority of somebody who has done his homework. And I think we count on the Spanish presidency to do things properly in Bonn.
Thank you. We've concluded this exceptionally lengthy round, but we were able to allow a large number of colleagues to take the floor, showing how much interest there is in Parliament in the subject we're discussing. So that brings us to the final part of the debate, and first of all we'll give the floor to the Minister, Mrs. Espinosa, so that she can react, and we'd like to say how happy we are to give her the floor. Thank you.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, President. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to express my thanks to all of you for your contributions, which doubtless will help us to improve things. I'm sorry I can't answer every single one of you, from the first comment to the last, but allow me, I'm being corrected by the President. There were 15 speakers in addition, but nonetheless I would like to add some words to what I said in my initial address. We have various challenges facing us on climate change. We have to consolidate the support and necessary level of commitment on the basis of the Copenhagen Agreement. We need to strengthen each of its different components, clarifying and developing its contents and ensuring its implementation. The Copenhagen Summit emphasized the new international scenario that we are acting upon, a scenario in which we need additional improvements, where new challenges and expectations are coming in from all sides, and the rules for the adoption of decisions mean that we need to make changes so that we can adapt to the new days, the new times and the new needs. And this is where the European Union needs to consider the way in which it can show leadership in the international scenario in terms of climate change. We should not lose sight of our objectives, because that would weaken our credibility and the position we've been adopting in the last few years. There is no better body than the European Union to know the difficulties of constructing this collective leadership. Nobody knows better than the advantages and the satisfaction of a result which will improve things for all of us, as is the case of this Parliament. At global level, we can only make progress if the course forward is based on mutual trust and the general interest. Copenhagen was described by some as a perfect storm with a bittersweet result, and I'd like to comment on something which I think is courageous, that is the huge amount of potential that we'll be able to act on in the months to come. And ladies and gentlemen, you can rest assured that we will be able to say that in Copenhagen the European Union was not the problem. Now, going into the various contributions, several of you referred to solidarity with third countries in reducing deforestation, a more efficient industry and more sustainable industry, and many referred to leadership and solidarity. And at this stage, I think that we need to encourage the immediate implementation of the Copenhagen Agreement, and we should promote the full integration of the agreement in the ordinary process and consolidate the base so that we can achieve more progress in Mexico. And I think that we need to remember the alliance between the different regions and sectors, and the European Union should try to reinforce and extend this alliance. We should work side by side, looking ahead to the future. We need to learn from each other and make progress. Let's look ahead. Let's think about what we want to hand on to future generations. And I think this Parliament can do a great deal in that respect. All of us together, the Member States, the Council of Ministers of the Environment, the Commission and the Parliament, and of course the Presidency, have an important role to play. And we need to act together rather than being divided, and all work together, all pull together for our common future. Let us not forget that the environment, innovation, development and competition are common objectives, and we should move forward on all these fronts in hand. I have taken note of all your contributions, and you can bear in mind that in the Spanish government we have the rotating presidency of the Union with the until the 30th of June, and you can trust in us to try to achieve a more sustainable future together with all of you. Thank you. Thank you, President. Thank you, Madam Minister. We'll conclude the debate now with a contribution by Mr. Olli Rehn, who will be reacting on behalf of the Commission to the different contributions to the debate. Mr. Rehn, you have the floor.
Señor Presidente, Señora Ministra, let me first of all thank you for a very substantive and responsible debate, and I will certainly pass your best wishes to my colleague Stavros Dimas for his recovery and for him being able to join you in the committee shortly. I took note of your points and I try to respond to some of them, to some of your concerns and policy positions on the basis of the briefings I've asked for during this debate. I think we can interpret your basic messages so that even though the Copenhagen Accord does not reflect our level of ambition, there is still a certain European fingerprint in it. In other words, the Copenhagen Accord contains references to the level of ambition needed to address climate change for the post-2012 climate agreement, sets the basis for a financial package and invites serious commitments on emissions reductions. And on our own behalf, concerning our commitments, the Coreper is meeting precisely right now, and the Commission and the Member States want to make a single submission. That's clear. The details are now under discussion, and I'm confident that we will be ready before the deadline of the 31st of January. This is the response to Madam McAvan, and also this should create a sound basis for such a single negotiating text that Madam Pietikäinen was calling for. At the same time, we should see the accord as a stepping stone for future major leaps in Mexico in future international climate negotiations. And Madam Hassi and many others have called for EU's leadership. I do agree, and the Commission is determined to ensure that the EU maintains its leadership position over the coming months and to transform this accord to the ambitious and legally binding treaty that we all want to see. I count on your support for this goal. Unfortunately, as has been rightly said in this debate, some of our important negotiating partners, such as China and the United States, have not been able or willing to commit themselves even closer as far as the European Union has done, which of course had a detrimental impact on the negotiations. It is clear for everyone that China in particular did not want to commit itself to seriously meaningful objectives. It is my personal view that the new Commission will have to define an overall China strategy for the European Union to better pursue and achieve our common interests with a view of climate policy, trade tensions and exchange rate policy. It is not acceptable that China's currency dumping is risking the economic recovery in Europe. And in the same way, we would expect that China is taking a serious commitment in the field of climate change policy. But let's also all recall that our leadership starts at home. We need to make every effort to fulfill our Kyoto commitments as we are approaching the finishing line. And we also need to ensure that new ambitious policies and measures are put forward that will lead us to the 20% or even 30% reduction goal that we have set for ourselves. And in order to achieve that, we need to invest in innovation and research, in resource efficient environmental and energy technologies, which will be at the heart of the new EU 2020 strategy we are currently preparing. And I do agree with Ms Dati and Grossetête, as well as Ek, that this implies that the EU 2020 will have to be a climate, industry and jobs strategy, and thus at the heart of the EU 2020 and at the heart of the economic revival of the European Union. I would also like to respond to Mr Davies still concerning his very concrete question, and I have verified and I can inform you that the use of €300 million allowances for carbon capture and storage should be decided on the 2nd of February in the respective comitology committee. And I can reassure you that we want to support 12 demo plants. 8 plants will be supported in the first round and the rest in the second round. So, ladies and gentlemen, to conclude, it is our duty for future generations to continue to lead by example and reach a legally binding agreement by the end of this year, ensuring a better and sustainable future for all. Thank you.
Gracias, señor Rehn.
Thank you, Mr. Rehn. We'll take this opportunity to wish the Commissioner all the very best in his new portfolio. I'm sure he'll do quite as well as he has done in this current portfolio. So thank you for that. The vote will take place at the first February part session, February 1 that is. So we'll take a brief break to allow Mrs. Wallis to take her seat and to preside over question time.
Good afternoon, colleagues. The next item on the agenda, and we should be starting almost on time, is question time to the Council. And I would welcome the Minister to this first question time with the Spanish Presidency. And we will now take the questions in order, but I would say that the first question by Mr. Atondo was in fact inadmissible as it concerned criminal law, which was the subject of a discussion yesterday, Tuesday. So we move straight away to question 2 from Mr. Mitchell concerning the credit crunch, loans for business. And Minister, the floor is yours.
Gracias, señora presidenta.
Thank you, Madam President. The problem of ensuring that companies have sufficient access to capital and the actions of Member States to achieve precisely this is a source of concern for Council. In fact, it's been a source of concern for some time. In January last year, Council noted that the Member States have implemented energetic and decisive actions to unblock credit markets inter alia. And then in springtime, the European Council announced that it was important to continue rolling out economic recovery measures, and it called on Council and Commission to weigh up the efficiency of measures adopted, and it was called upon to inform the June Council of the results. The June Council duly assessed the efficiency of these measures adopted by Member States to support the financial sector and the stability of financial markets. These results were put into a report to the Council, and in that report there was a positive message. Guarantees and recapitalization measures had been put in place by the Member States, so Member States had played a crucial role in stopping the rot. Towards the end of 2008, indeed, there was the potential of total collapse in the financial system. So there were positive actions to allow banks to have access to credit and to allow credit to flow to the real economy. The Council believed that indeed measures adopted by Member States had played an important role in stabilizing the markets. Now, at the moment, the banking sector is still subject to pressure, and that's why the Council called on the Member States to recapitalize, to do away with uncertainties and thus to expedite the granting of credit. So last month in December, Council took note of the fact that the Member States had implemented a broad range of supporting and flanking measures to re-establish financial stability, though they underscored the fact that that recovery was still brittle and fragile, and it called on its being regularly informed on the availability of credit markets. So there's a raft of measures in place and flanking measures adopted by Council. The European Council has provided guidance on the matter, and so there has been an improvement. Now this of course goes hand in hand with the action of the European Central Bank, as is only logical. So this has improved access to liquidity and to credit for companies. Thank you very much, Madam President.
Thank you, Minister, and I'm sure that Mr. Mitchell has a supplementary question.
Thank you, Madam President, and thank the Minister for his reply. Can I say to the Minister that it's my experience that some banks, by no means all banks, but some banks, perhaps even a lot of banks, behaved irresponsibly during the financial market growth, and some banks, perhaps again not all banks, but many banks, are continuing to behave irresponsibly in the time of the budding weeks and months of recovery. I'm aware, for example, in Dublin of one particular company, very well